Welcome back to webinar 2 in this important and informative series brought to you by the University of Southern Queensland's Northern Australian Climate Program. The University of Queensland, and in collaboration with the Southern Queensland Northern New South Wales Innovation Hub, has helped to bring this together as well. The NACP project is funded by Meat and Livestock Australia and the Drought and Climate Adaptation Program. Today, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into this complex topic of livestock thermal stress and what it means for health, welfare, and productivity of your stock, and how it can likely impact your business. Due to time limits, we won't be responding to questions live today. You will find as the series progresses, though, that many of your questions that we've been able to capture in your registrations will be answered as the series goes on. Those more complex ones, we have flagged them, and we're going to be taking those to the Q&A panel session at the field days for some robust conversation. I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to please register to attend one of the field days closest to you, or indicate if you'd like to have one in your area. I encourage you throughout the session today and in the post-webinar survey at the end of today's session to please participate in those polls and surveys. Not only does this help us to better understand and address from a research perspective the impacts livestock thermal stress is having on production systems, it also helps us to demonstrate the value of a learning series like this to our project funders and funding partners. Whether you're a cattle or sheep producer or working in livestock extension and consultancy, I'm certain today especially will offer you some new insights into strategies for better managing thermal stress in your livestock production systems. So in today's webinar, we're going to look at how livestock thermal regulate for heat and chill stress, and why lung health is so vitally important. And we'll also take a look at how those production systems may be impacted by our thermal stress in our livestock. So buckle up, you're in for an enlightening and informative ride today. So to kick things off, I'm going to hand over to Professor John Goggin. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Vicky. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So first session today, I'm just going to go through thermoregulation in livestock. Watch the slides will move. I had this one up last week, and just here to just remind everyone just how complex this area is. So it's not an easy area to fully understand what's going on. There's lots of things happening at the same time, and so it can be difficult to actually work out what's happening with an animal at any particular time. But that's just there from what we covered last time. One of the things that often gets discussed when we start talking about thermoregulation is this concept of this thermoneutral zone, the TNZ. And in that area, it's where livestock are sitting when they're not really expending too much energy to maintain warmth or energy to stay cool. And it's not a set range. It moves around a lot depending on the type of animals that we're dealing with, what their metabolic status is. There's a whole range of things that we're interested in. But when we start talking about either heat or cold stress, one of the things we know when we move into cold areas of production, cold areas, heat production's got to go up to maintain this deep body temperature. That's from the top line. As we move away from the thermoneutral zone, we reach a point where heat production actually starts to go up again. It sort of drops through that period coming up to the hot zone. It actually goes up again when we get into really hot conditions. And we've got evaporative heat loss happening really once we get outside that thermoneutral zone. And that's once we see that evaporative cooling taking place, we know that we've got a animal that's trying to cope with the heat. So evaporative cooling, in terms of it's going to be a heat loss mechanism, and it could be sweating, panting, wetting the body surfaces. There's a number of things animals will do to get this evaporative cooling going. We also have sensible heat loss, and sensible heat loss, you can see here it's going down initially, and it just keeps going down all the way through. Sensible heat loss can be either gain or loss, whereas evaporative cooling is essentially all loss. So the sensible heat is where we get this heat transfer from an animal to the environment, or environment to animal, or animal to animal. And it's basically either a gain or a loss. Okay, so when we start to look at some of these heat transfer mechanisms that animals have in place, and the first thing I just want to highlight to people is that it's not about controlling body temperature per se, it's about keeping the brain cool. That's the priority. So when animals get hot, body temperature will go up and it'll reach a point where they need to make sure the brain keeps cool, because if the brain doesn't keep cool, then the animal's in trouble. This is when we start to get heat stroke and those sort of things. So cooling the brain is the priority. Ange will talk a bit more about panting and so on a little bit later on in this session. But if you look at this animal here, what it's doing, it's actually stunking its head in the water, and it's trying to keep the brain cool. It's not interested in keeping the body temperature down now. It's about keeping the brain cool. There's also this endogenous heat, so the normal internal body temperature of the animal, which is being driven primarily by metabolism and digestion, but it can also be activated by exercise. So just walking around the pen, loading onto a truck, whatever it might be, can actually increase body temperature, and I'll come back to that point. Some species have really good ways of actually maintaining this brain temperature. And this is just a bit of a diagram here to show this in sheep and goats. So evaporative cooling is they breathe through the nasal cavity and they're panting away, and you get this hot blood coming up from the body, and it goes through this whole mess of blood vessels and things here, and this cool blood's coming down through the nasal passages. It's cooling the hot blood that's going to the brain. So this is a very effective way of the animal actually keeping that blood that's going to the brain cool, not the body. It's not controlling body temperature. It's keeping the brain cool. So when you see an animal panting, it's more about how am I keeping this heat exchange going here. So I've got cool blood going to the brain and not hot blood going to the brain. So it's an important thing to see. Panting is about keeping the brain cool. It's not about decreasing body temperature. Movement of animals can have significant increases in body temperature. Loading cattle, in this study we did, we were able to see an increase in body temperature of 1 degree Celsius by just walking the animals 25 meters and loading them onto a truck, which is what's happening here. So we increased body temperature by loading them on the truck. These cattle were not heat stressed. They're just at normal body temperature. But if they were heat stressed and they were already at 39.8 or 38.9, and we add another degree onto them, we pushed those animals over the edge. So again, it's really important when we start to think about how we manage animals during these hot periods of time. And one of the things we do have some control over is cattle movement. And so we need to really consider that as part of our management strategy. And I know a lot of people have already do this in terms of stopping animal movements and so on. Radiation is the primary external source of heat, and this is really why shade is an important component. They don't have a lot of ways of dealing with this radiation heat load except being under shade. And we know that shade is important, and we'll continue to come back to that. There's also a whole range of other things that happen in terms of behavior and physiological controls that animals go through. But we need to remember also, again, that this evaporative cooling is really the best way animals have of transferring body heat back to the environment, unless they can do things like go and stand in dams or troughs and so on. So animals will go in seeking shade when they're hot, and depending on the breed or the species, will determine what that temperature is. But typically for a Bos taurus animal that's not really adapted to warm conditions, they start looking for shade around about 22 degrees. So it's not necessarily hot, but they actually start looking for the shade. The other side of the coin is where we have cold conditions, and I mentioned last time about the importance of wind and how that impacts on heat loss from the animals. So if animals are under cold conditions, then windbreaks of some description become really important in terms of how we can manage this. The other important component here, though, is this temperature gradient between the skin, the hair wool surface, and the external environment, because that's really what starts to determine how much heat gain or loss can occur. And this is influenced by hair type and length. So just quickly looking at this middle one here, this is a merino sheep, and we can see from the type of hair wool that's on that animal, internal body temperature is 39 degrees. At an air temperature of 40 degrees, we're actually seeing an air surface temperature of 85 degrees on the top of that wool. So what that means is then that because the top of the wool is so hot compared to the rest of the body, heat's actually being dissipated out to the environment. A Bos indicus animal, again, 39 degrees internal body temperature, external surface is 46 degrees. So it's important, again, we start to think about heat loss and heat gain, that we take into consideration the type of hair coat the animals have, skin thickness. There's a whole range of things that start to play a role here. But it's again, it's this wind speed that becomes an important component, which we talked about previously. And really it's then about this blood flow to the periphery of the animals, particularly during hot conditions. So what we'll see happening is that under hot conditions, so we want to increase heat loss, more blood will flow to the capillaries and vessels closer to the skin, and they move closer to the skin, they get bigger, more blood flow. When it's cold, the opposite starts to happen, and it gets pulled back in. The way they can lose heat from this is improved or increased by having airflow over the animal, and if possible, depending on the species again, having a wet skin surface. Radiation shelter, as we mentioned, is really important. I just want to show this diagram here on the right. This is for 5 kilogram lambs, and what it's showing is the amount of extra energy they need to maintain body weight under different environmental conditions. So the bottom line is getting down to 0 degrees compared to 25, 26 degrees. They need an extra 4 megajoules per day of energy. If we put high wind speed on top of those, then it goes up to 5. So 3.5 to 5. So a lot more energy is required in the system if we don't have some way of managing that heat. Evaporative heat loss, primarily sweating. A lot of people think cattle don't sweat, but that's the primary mechanism. Panting is a secondary mechanism. It does contribute a little bit to heat loss in the animal, and again, Ange will talk more about that, but primarily it's via sweating and in cattle, whereas in sheep, it's primarily through the panting. Livestock do not conserve or do not maintain body temperature tightly during hot days. The aim is to, not the ale, but the aim is to dissipate the heat at night. And why they do that, it's one, to conserve energy. So animals are geared up to conserve energy as much as possible. So conserving energy, keeping the brain cool, works really well, providing the nights are not too hot. If the nights are hot, then body temperature remains elevated, and livestock start the next day already compromised. So just a couple of quick things just to finish off, but again, Ange will touch more on this. I just wanted to show these two diagrams to show that as panting goes up, so we get to see an increase in panting in these animals, we see an increase in respiration rate. So the one on the left here is for cattle, an increase in rumen temperature on those animals. So panting is not maintaining body temperature in those animals at all. And similarly with, but better with sheep, it goes up, but then it starts to stabilize out. So as you get these really high panting scores or respiration rates in sheep, we do start to see that cooling effect coming through, which we don't see in cattle. So with respiration rates, shade has a big impact on on those. So again, it's important in that context, and I'll come back to this a little bit later on today. Significantly lower body temperature if we've got access to shade, and you've got to remember, that animals that are up here with these very high body temperatures, they're going to have a lot more energy expenditure than the ones that are down below here. So it's going to start to impact on productivity, which I'll discuss. So just in summary, before I hand over to Ange, thermoregulation is complex. It's an interaction between the animals and the environment and us, management. Livestock will allow body temperature increase when we've got hot weather, conserves energy, keeps the brain cool, works really well if nights are cool. What we need to consider when we're managing these animals is the intensity by the duration of the heat event or cold event, and then whatever relief is in there. And again, keep in mind that the primary way most animals can actively reduce their internal body heat production is through reducing feed intake. And as I mentioned previously, shade is probably the best management option. So with that, I'll stop sharing and hand over to you, Ange.
Thanks, John. All right,
Have I stopped? Yep.
Yep, let's share some slides. Hopefully you're now seeing my slides, is that correct?
Yes.
Yep, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about panting score and what it is. And I've got a couple of videos embedded in here. We did do a run through before and they're not showing up as well as they could. So we'll try to embed those in some communication to you so you can see them at a later date. But I just want to touch on a couple of things that we've talked to you about previously. So last week when we met, we talked about humidity and how it impacts evaporative loss from the body. And generally, John's right, particularly when we talk about cattle, there's this initial sweating response, and then we start relying on the respiratory dynamics and a change in respiratory dynamics. And this is really important because as ambient temperature gets closer and closer or exceeds body temperature, that evaporative loss becomes our primary pathway for dissipating or getting rid of heat from the body. So obviously for an Australian context, we spend a fair bit of time through our summers above 32 degrees. So this is something that we need to keep in the back of our minds fairly well. As I said, this is our realistically our primary sort of transfer of heat from the body. And what we see particularly in cattle and sheep and other species is that we see this change in respiration, but also panting. And the reason why animals go through this and do this change is that we're trying to prevent or scale some of that response in body temperature. So maintaining body temperature is really important. It's what maintains equilibrium inside the body. As you can imagine all those chemical responses that aid digestion and general cell transfer happens at a perfect set body temperature across species. So when we start to throw that out a little bit, we can start to impact how cell signaling, and this is where the impacts to reproduction and other things come from. So when it comes down to it, really, we're interested in what's happening from these changes in a respiratory dynamics so that we can sort of start to figure out what's happening from a regulation perspective. Now, when it comes to panting score, and I don't know whether we've heard this terminology before, but realistically, what we're talking about is what we can visually see from a respiratory dynamics perspective. So you can go out into a paddock, and we do a lot of this work in feedlots, as most of the examples that we provide have come from. But you can see that animals are breathing really fast or they're breathing at a normal rate. So by using what we call as this panting score technique, it gives us a really nice indicator around how hard animals are working from a respiratory perspective in context of that environment. So for what we consider as low-grade panting, it's sort of fairly standard first phase breathing responses. And then we start to talk about open mouth panting, which is our second phase response. And we're starting to see a really big shift in that respiratory dynamics and how we visually see them. The reason why we want to use panting scores and we rely on them a lot is that it's a really good indicator of thermal status. So I think everyone can probably appreciate that we can see this Angus steer on the photo here with the open mouth, tongue hanging out. I think we would all be on the same page when we say that guy's not really coping with the environment all that well at that point in time. The other side of this too is that panting scores are fairly dynamic, so they are constantly changing, and so they can also give us that indication of the changing status. And these animals here, I've got some videos to show you as well, but they will go through phases where they have their mouth open and they're panting really hard and they're working really hard with their environment, but then they'll all of a sudden stop and they'll go back to a closed mouth breathing. And some of that's tied in with sort of trying to buffer the system out a little bit too, and sort of preventing some changes to blood pH and other aspects of the system. The really good thing about panting score is that we can assess it as an individual, like this Angus steer that's on the green here, or we can also scan a group of animals and like all good science, punch it into an equation, and it gives us an indicator of how a group of animals are coping with their environment as well. The thing that's really appealing about panting scores in particular is that because you can rely on this sort of open, closed mouth breathing and that visual dynamic, you don't have to manually stand there counting respiration rates, which, if you're, working in an 80,000 head feedlot, or if you've got cows in a paddock, you can appreciate that going through and doing an individual respiratory rate on everyone is going to be a giant pain in the backside. So this provides us with that really nice visual appraisal that you can almost do a quick scan of a paddock or a pen, and you can get a good appreciation for how those animals are coping at that particular time point. So this is the traditional table that we use when we are evaluating panting scores. So it's a 0 to 4.5 scale. So a 0 is what you would effectively see when animals are cool, calm, and collected. Certainly wouldn't have seen any panting through the weekend for most of the Queensland and northern New South Wales, that's for sure. But right through to that 4.5, where we see that open mouth, tongue extended, we at times see excessive drooling, but that might also back off a little bit as well. So this is some work that actually John Goggin and Professor Terry Mader did, I think in the early 2000s. John might have to correct me when he comes back to us. And they give us sort of those indicative respiratory rate ranges that are associated with some of these panting scores. So you can see they do give us that sort of nice correlation between what's happening from that open closed mouth breathing and respiration rate. So they do provide that really nice indicator of how animals are coping. So we often get asked this question around, okay, so we talk about panting scores an awful lot, and we can go out and we can look at animals and we can evaluate panting scores. But at what point are animals actually compromised? So I've got this little video here. And again, I'm happy to provide the link and we can embed it into some communications for you. But these two Angus steers that are standing here, head dunking again, that's that brain cooling. So we're trying to keep the brain cool. This was some cattle that we had in the research feedlot here at the University of Queensland a couple of years ago, a wee while ago now. But it's quite clear that those animals are very hot, very uncomfortable. We're head wetting, we're trying to cool down. These are classic, what we call excessive heat load responses or heat stressed animals. So they're not coping, they're doing the open mouth panting. From that point in time, there's a big compromise to the system from an immune perspective, but also a production perspective. And generally, these animals aren't comfortable. So these conditions that those animals were in through that particular event, they were, if memory serves me, heat load index above 100. So I think at that point in time, we were looking at 110. So very, very hot, acute heat challenge that was put onto these animals. Animals out, oops, sorry. This is some work that I did when I was at UNE. And again, it's another shade experiment, and this might look a little bit choppy to you, but we'll play it and embed it. But you can see hopefully that the three animals in this particular video, you've got the black baldy there that's got a little bit of a head rock going. The Murray Grey that's laying down, it's got a little bit of a rocking motion going as well. And the Limo Sanipole cross looking thing there has got a fast sort of chest cavity movement. So the thing here is that these animals on this particular footage are low-grade panting, but these animals are still compromised. And what we mean by that is that their respiration rates are elevated. And as soon as we see those changes to respiration rates and we see that sort of marked response, you're starting to take energy away from production. We often have this conversation about describing at what point animals become compromised. And realistically, it is this low-grade panting that you start to see changes in metabolic responses, and you start to see that division of energy away from what we would want to call non-essential body services. So growth, production, lactation, even starting to take energy away from fetuses as well. So it is important to sort of understand that as soon as we start to see this difference and the change in that respiratory dynamics, that we're starting to visualize that there's a metabolic difference happening in the body. We also get some questions around what happens from a Bos indicus breed, and I put this video in and hopefully she plays quite nicely for you as well. So this is, again, it's a feedlot experiment. This is actually animals that were under shade cloth. This cow here is not under shade cloth, clearly. But you can, again, there see that she's got this rocking motion that is a low-grade panting response. So we are, again, seeing that shift in energy dynamics in the system. So it's a bit important to wrap our minds around that a little bit as well. So when we talk about these changes in respiratory dynamics, the general consensus that we see is that those small changes in respiratory dynamics, so as soon as we start to elevate respiratory rate, and as soon as we start to see those low-grade panting scores, we're seeing an increase in energy demand across the system. John sort of pointed out in his slides that one of the primary responses that we see from animals is a decline in dry matter intake. And that is, there's a very nice consensus. Doesn't matter what species we talk about when we're talking about reductions to feed intake, they all do it. This is one of the complicating challenges of heat stress and dealing with heat stressed animals, is that we know as soon as we see those changes in respiratory dynamics, we know that we've got an increase in energy demand. So they have to effectively steal that energy from somewhere else in the system. And generally that is from those growth and productivity traits that we see is really important for the sustainability of our production enterprises. So that's only on a low-grade panting, is that we see that up to 25%. When we see high-grade panting, I'm not actually sure how much that energy demand increases in the system, but it's got to be an awful lot. And it does take animals a long time to compensate for that. So we do go through periods of compensatory gain, but often what you'll see, and John will start to talk about this in the next little section, is that we don't see animals come back to totally where they were prior to going into one of these acute challenges specifically. And I guess to sort of help put some concept and some metrics around there was some really nice work that came out of Lance Baumgard's lab in the US, and this is a dairy model data. But one of the big things around a heat stress model is that there's a significant or a big activation of the immune system. And the team did some really nice work there around, okay, well, we know that heat stress is a problem, but it's also tied into the immune system. So we're going to get some dairy cows and we're going to put them under an immune challenge to see how much that immune system actually needs from an energy perspective to maintain production outputs. So effectively, these guys, they put these cows under a challenge and they put them onto a glucose pump to maintain normal glycemia, so blood glucose concentration in the system. Effectively, what those guys did was put 2 kilograms of sugar into these immuno-challenged cows and it didn't prevent the changes to milk synthesis or production, that lactation yield out of those cows. So that tells us realistically that the immune system and the energy demands of the immune system are exceptional, and it requires a lot of energy from the system to keep the system going forward when we're under these sorts of challenges. So one thing that we've sat back from at the outcome of this work and is gone, okay, well, we know that when cows are heat stressed and they're doing this increase in respiratory dynamics, we know that there's an activation of the immune system as well, and we know that there's these other things happening in the system. How much sugar effectively would we actually need to give them to make sure that they've got enough to maintain themselves? And currently we don't have an answer for that, but it's an awful lot. And that's something that we do know, is that energy required to just maintain a status quo in the system is something that we can't provide these animals, particularly when they do the dry matter declines that they do. One thing that we need to kind of be careful about when we talk about panting scores and evaluating this aspect of what we do is that a lot of the work that we do know about comes from feedlots and live export and in lactating cows as well. So there's some aspects here that we don't know about what's happening from a respiratory dynamics perspective. You know, in your average grazing beef cow in the north, we don't really know how much they're compensating for body temperature changes. We don't have a good understanding of what that shift in energy demands is going to be, but we do know that those cows are going to be exposed to multiple stresses at the same time. So this might be things like locomotion stress, so that whether they've got to walk 5 or 10 k's out to water, what their nutritional status looks like, are they pregnant or non-pregnant, are they lactating and pregnant? And all of these things come into how that animal is going to interact with the thermal environment. So particularly from a grazing perspective, we've still got a lot of questions in this space, and we're starting to work towards unpacking that a little bit. But this is where we come from a panting score perspective, and this is why we see the responses that we see. And that is the last of my slides. So I'm going to stop sharing now and hand back to John, and John's going to talk to us about feedlot production impacts.
Thanks, Ange. Just get my slides back up. Okay, so Ange has given a really good introduction to what I'm going to talk about now, and it's really around what happens in feedlots. We have a pretty good understanding, as Ange said, in terms of what goes on with these animals. So I just put down some ideas around this, and we know what the production impacts largely are. We know it costs money. Ange mentioned reduction of dry matter intake, and there's some long-term impacts with this, and I'll show you a couple of diagrams on that in a minute. There's lots of sort of add-on effects around that as well. So you think about if you put feed out and cattle don't eat it, it's got to be removed. Water access becomes very important. I've had the misfortune of looking at lots of cattle deaths, particularly in the US a few years ago, and many of the animals that die in feedlots over there die of dehydration. It's not necessarily the heat that kills them as such, they're dehydrated. So water access is very important, and we know that's going to have a big impact on things then like dry matter intake and so on. We see reduced average daily gain. We see reduced feed efficiency, so more feed for less gain around this. There's a risk of acidosis. There is an increased risk of disease, but there's some debate around this. Again, one of the things we see with a lot of cattle that do die from in a heat wave sort of environment is that they either have BRD or have had it recently, so the lungs are compromised. And if we've got these animals that are going to have to be breathing at 120 breaths per minute, if their lungs are compromised, they're not going to make it. So that becomes an important thing. So it may not necessarily be an increased risk of disease, but cattle that have got disease or have been sick are at more risk. We also know there's a whole range of issues around carcass quality, still not 100% sure of what goes on here. But we do see things like reduced marbling, and particularly in long-fed cattle. Cattle deaths, luckily, are rare, so we don't have that many compared to, for example, again, what happens in the US and feedlots. But there's not just the loss of those animals, the associated cost of dealing with the carcasses and so on. And we know that shade's going to reduce the impact, but it does not always take the risk to zero. So shade's part of a management system. It's not the one and only answer to what we see here. So looking at what happens with dry matter intake. So we've got these animals up here at the start of this. So this is day 65 on feed, going up to about day 75. And they're meandering along pretty good in terms of what their feed intake is. An acute heat wave event comes through and feed intake crashes. So these animals have gone from about 12 kilograms of dry matter intake a day down to between 5 and 7 kilograms a day. And that's a huge energy loss. And as Ange mentioned, on top of this, they've got this extra energy demand from this high respiration rate and panting. So not only are we burning energy off those animals in terms of trying to keep those animals cool in terms of the respiration rate, but we've also decreased the amount of energy that's going into the animals. So they're really being hit twice. Once they come out of the heat, the other thing that's a problem is we go back into this chronic summer heat stress. This was over summer months. And one of the things we see that they don't come back up to the level they were previously. So they remain compromised. They're not suffering, they're not heat stressed, but they're just not going to grow as well as they did beforehand. We've lost a fair level of productivity in these animals. I think there's some of the work that Steph did that she'll be presenting the next session. But one of the other areas around that we've seen is particularly around this acute heat stress, which is in the red box here, is the impact on rumen pH. So what we see previous to the heat event is rumen pH is going through just a normal diurnal pattern around the dry matter intake. We get into a heat event, and because they're eating less and probably drinking more water, the rumen pH actually goes up to an extent because they haven't got the grain intake in the feedlot environment. And when they come out of that event and they start to go back onto normal feed, we see a big reduction in rumen pH. So this is a very risky time for these animals, and this is why feed needs to be managed going in, because we're going to potentially could have some huge production losses in this area. So the heat stress is gone, but the animals have not recovered fully. So they're still out in this sort of a danger zone. And the other thing to notice here too is that the rumen pH fluctuates a lot more. So some of the impacts on performance, and there's been I guess a few studies done now around looking at this. Most of what we look at is comparison between shade and no shade, because we don't have any other way of really looking at it under commercial conditions. So shade being the mitigator of the heat load to an extent, no shade, obviously no mitigation in that regard. Everything else exactly the same. But what we see with the impacts of shade on animals, in this particular study, we ended up with 6 kilograms more carcass weight from the shaded steers. We had better growth performance in those animals, better feed efficiency in those animals, and really feed efficiencies, the driver here, because it's what's going to cost you the most money in terms of gain in those animals. So this is another study that was done. Final body weight increased by 9.3 kilograms. The cattle that were under shade consumed 2 kilograms less per day for the same performance level, and the carcass weight was again another 6.7 kilograms heavier. So these animals that had the heavier weight, they ate less feed, they grew better feed efficiency, and therefore higher productivity from those animals. It's the same group of animals, but looking at feed cost. they ate more for less gain overall. So the animals that were zero here with no shade consumed $55 more per animal in feed, but had lower levels of productivity. So these long-term effects, they catch up, they get this compensatory gain going, but they eat a lot more feed to get to the same endpoint. During the compensatory gain phase, the cattle that were under no shade consumed about 12 kilograms of feed for 1 kilogram of gain. The cattle that had shade, again, in the recovery period after the heat wave, were eating about 7 kilograms. So a big difference in terms of feed intake for performance. I mentioned earlier about movement of cattle. Just want to show one thing here, which is this diagram here. These cattle were moved. Air temperature was 20.4 degrees. They walked about 100 meters. The key thing here is even after 5 hours after the event, these animals were not eating. So very important, if you're going to move animals, even if it's not hot, it's going to have an impact on feed intake. So if they're not eating, they're not growing, it's costing us money. So just to summarize this a little bit, reductions in dry matter intake during acute events may not be regained, so we have a permanent loss in those animals. Long-term production loss is therefore likely. We know it's going to have negative impacts on the carcass. Management's important. Shade improve production, especially when we have heat waves occurring, and especially with high-end cattle that are long fed. And then we also need to think about cattle movements, and these should really be restrained during those periods if we don't want to have negative production impacts. So I will finish on that and hand over to Kieran.
John, we're just going to throw actually over to Steph.
Steph, sorry.
Kieran's just having a bit of internet trouble there. So Steph's just going to slot in there to give Kieran a little bit of time to get set back up. So over to you, Steph.
Sure thing. Thanks, Vicky. I'll just pull up my slides. Okay, so leading on from those last few discussions on the importance of thermoregulation, particularly around panting, we're going to be focusing in on the importance of lung health, specifically early life when it comes to pneumonia, and the implications that has for not only animal productivity, but for heat stress. And we've all seen it at one stage or another in our stock. Case of pneumonia, usually aligned with a stress event, whether that is weaning, off-feed event, trucking, or housing in intensive housing systems such as a feedlot. It's a multifactorial disease, meaning that it is both a bacterial and viruses can cause pneumonias, and it can be very costly. And for ruminants, this condition can be particularly tricky when we start looking at the physiological differences of our cows, for example, compared to a horse. With the oxygen consumption a cow is requiring is significantly greater than a horse of the same body size. So about that 50% difference. So you would think that a cow, to compensate for all this extra oxygen that is required, her lung volume would be significantly greater. But unfortunately, it's the opposite.
Sorry, Steph, we're seeing your slide deck, not your presenter mode.
Don't know how to fix that.
You switch. That's it.
That solved it?
Good job.
Yep.
Sorry, guys.
Don't stress, I do it all the time.
So just go through the slides very quickly again. Causes of pneumonia: stress, multifactorial, bacterial, and viral. And when we look at this table that's now up on your screen, when we look at oxygen consumption differences between a cow and a horse, for example, we'll see that a cow has to consume a significantly more oxygen, but her lung volume is very quite small. Even when comparing a ewe, her oxygen consumption to lung volume is not as significantly different compared to a bovine. So often, particularly in cattle, the lungs are considered that rate limiting organ. So when something goes wrong in terms of health, or when they're predisposed to high heat load conditions, it's often the lungs that really become that compromised organ. And when we start thinking about implications for heat stress, research has shown that high heat load environmental conditions can exacerbate pneumonia in particularly beef cattle in feedlots. And if you think even in early life, a bout of pneumonia around weaning, even when the infection clears, that lung damage can remain through whole of life and impact that animal's productivity. And if there is lung damage, because they're already compromised in those lung thermoregulatory capabilities, any reduction in lung health is going to increase susceptibility to heat stress and their heat dissipation capabilities through panting. And if we look to the research to show this is some heifer calf work done, and they were followed these heifer calves that had high lung lesions through using lung ultrasound, which I'll discuss in a few slides, and then followed them through whole of life when they entered that milking herd. And those heifer calves that developed pneumonia early life had reduced survival rates, were culled from the herd earlier, had decreased reproductive performances. You can see in the graph here, they had longer period of time open, they weren't as fertile, and they also had lower milk production. So there's implications for increasing susceptibility to heat stress, but also whole of life animal performance. And the same for feedlot cattle. This was in some feedlot heifers, and a history of pneumonia increased the respiratory stress levels in terms of increase in respiration rate and panting score significantly compared to those other healthy herd mates during the summer. And that translated into those animals that had cases of pneumonia having lower average daily gain and feed efficiencies. So it's really going to be impacting the bottom line. For sheep, there's not been that research specifically linking pneumonia with heat stress dissipation capabilities, but there has been some interesting recent sheep work that John did touch on in previous webinars on those epigenetic effects. So this was a nice trial where single bearing ewes were exposed to heat stress conditions in the last 2 months of gestation compared to ewes that were housed in thermoneutral conditions, and then they followed these lambs through whole of life. And really quite contrasting photos here. Those heat stress lambs were lighter, the ewes produced a lot less milk, placenta weight was significantly reduced, and they followed these lambs through a few months, and those lambs never caught up with their weight gain. And the next part of this research is following that offspring's whole of life in terms of wool growth, animal performance, and looking at the impacts of heat stress and hopefully linking that, of course, to lung health further down the line. So as mentioned, when we look at lung health, what is a tool that is being adopted widely within Australia and the world is lung ultrasound. It's a tool that I use for the last few years for both educational and research purposes with success shown here in feedlot cattle, beef weaners, dairy calves, feedlot lambs, and even dairy goat kids. So it's a very powerful tool that works for all ruminants, and it's really great, particularly for that early life, evaluating nutrition and health programs, what implications that has on lung lesion score, pneumonia, and then that animal's productive life, and linking that back to, of course, come for heat stress capabilities. And for those that may be interested in learning more, there is a great set of training videos online from the University of Wisconsin-Madison looking at lung ultrasounds and the different locations that you can scan. And just quickly to bring up some videos of what we see on during ultrasound. That crisp white line indicated by the arrow there is the lung surface, and everything below that is lung tissue. So this is a very healthy beef weaner. And as soon as we start getting pneumonia developed, we can very clearly see via the ultrasound these lung lesions forming, where we get breaks in the lung surface and we get these lobular lesions beginning to progress. And we can continually scan these animals to see how quick they recover based on what nutritional and management health strategies we implement. So this was a trial conducted in central Queensland over the course of 2 years. And what I was really wanting to look into was the progression of those lung lesion scores from a stress event being weaning, and how that sudden dietary change through this emerging research space linking the gut-lung axes. So how changes in the gut microbiome from a stress event such as weaning can trigger this cascading and signaling, which can then cause disease in the lungs, and the implications this then has on animal productivity. And so what is happening to the lungs of calves at weaning? So we allocate lung lesion scores from a 0 healthy, so shown here in the purple, all the way through up to a lung score of 5. So this particular mob of cattle were a very well managed station. But you can see, regardless, at yard entry, so on day 1 of weaning, around 10% of those calves had early onset pneumonia, so a lung score of 1. And then 7 days later, when they exited that yard, there was significantly more calves with low-grade lung lesion scores. And then 30 days spent out in the paddock, we brought them back in, scanned them again. You can see, even though they had exited the yards into the paddock, the challenge, that lung health pneumonia challenge, was still escalating even in the paddock. And those animals that had early onset low-grade lung lesion scores, they were the ones there in the red with that lung score 3. So it's really important through different nutrition and management strategies to help equip our young stock to address these lung health challenges early in life for whole of life animal productivity. And that's just pictorially here shown is this gut-lung axis. So how an insult to the gut, that shift in that rumen microbiome population, can trigger that signaling pathway to the lung and start causing disease and pneumonia. And there's been a lot of research in early life nutrition, particularly in feedlot, what nutritional and feeding management strategies can reduce the severity of this lung health challenge. And just to touch on one of these trials, this was a group of 24 Holstein Angus bull calves where they challenged them with a BRSV inoculant. And the only difference in their diets was an immunoregulatory supplement, in this case, a postbiotic. And through strategic nutritional strategies, it's better equipping our young stock to respond to a pneumonia challenge such as this. And it's really quite contrasting, the pictures, when you start looking at them. So all of this to say, when we're thinking about heat stress, to better equip our animals really starts early in life for all ruminants. So early life nutrition, and there's a whole heap of research out there on different feeds and additives and feeding management and health strategies. And really, when we're looking to improve lung health and better equip our animals to respond to a lung health challenge, it's all about stabilizing the gut to reduce that microbiome shift, that microbacteria death in the gut, which triggers this cascade signaling to the lungs, causing disease. We want to really support those rumen micro populations and maintain intake. Dry matter intake, really critical in all of this research work. So as more work comes forward in terms of the benefits of getting lung health right, not only for animal productivity, but for the animal's heat stress capabilities. And that's me done. So I'll send back over to you, Vicky.
Let's see if we can get enough bandwidth there at Dirranbandi.
Yep, thank you. Can you just confirm that's coming through well, Vicky, for me, if you don't mind?
Yeah, really well, Kieran, really well.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so what I suppose the task I was given for today was to try and look at the production impacts of the free grazing cattle, or the cattle that are just, our typical sort of northern environment. But a lot of the take-home messages apply to other livestock as well. It's just that most of my experiences with cattle, and I've drawn on that for this presentation. So just to start off, just the risk of heat stress. So we've on a project that we've currently got running, which is we've got 12 collaborating properties across northern Australia. Regardless of what temperature or what metric we use, all the thresholds are indicating that livestock in northern Australia are subjected to periods of high heat loads. So what is the impact of that? So I won't dwell on this a lot because I think that everyone else has covered this really well, and there's been spoken about a number of times. But what are the production impacts? Same as what John alluded to and others presented. From a growth point of view, mainly it's about food intake, conversion rates, and just reduced average daily gain and carcass quality because of that, essentially that energy input into the system. From a reproduction point of view, we get hormonal changes, physiological influence, as well as energy-related drivers affecting both female and male reproduction. So in high heat stress events, heat load events, you could animals, or male animals in particular, that can't thermoregulate, they could be out if they compromise semen quality for 8 weeks if it's a complete failure there. So from the calf survival point of view, we know that blood flow to the uterus is impacted. We know that in utero growth is impacted by heat stress. There's not a number of documented papers around all these things, and as I said before, a number of previous presenters has drawn that evidence out. Now, what we have seen in the research, and this is some of the research that's currently underway, is growing evidence about changes in behaviour in association with heat stress, and this is things we see in the paddock all the time. But as temperature humidity index increases, the daily in the water, around the water. And just to demonstrate those points, in the same study, this is the Calf Alive study, which is currently underway. If we look at the total proportion of time or of a day that the average animal is spending resting, using the GPS trackers, it remains relatively constant on a daily basis. But when you separate that data into night and day, what you see is that they're actually augmenting when they're doing their grazing, or when they're resting, I should say. So during the daytime, you can see an inflection point there when we run that through analytically, that above a THI of around 79, during the day, they start resting more with an increasing. So as it gets hotter past that threshold value, there's an increased amount of the time in the daytime that they're resting. And making sense, because they're on a totally overall daily basis, they're spending the same amount of time resting. That just means that during the nighttime, they're spending less time resting above a THI.
We've just lost Kieran again there, and
Taking that. Sorry, Ricky.
No, you're right, mate. You just keep dropping out on us there, Kieran. So I'm just wondering how much more of your presentation you've got to go there, whether or not, in the interest of time, and being able to get just a bit better set up with that internet connection, if we can continue over at the start of next week's webinar there.
Yeah,
We're just missing some of those key, sort of some key lines there from you, unfortunately.
yeah, thank you. And I'm very sorry about the situation.
No, look, better you're at your parents' place helping with shearing and getting that hard work done. And we can all understand as producers what it's like trying to manage for our internet connections that we do have. So I really do thank you for persisting and keep trying to get back online there today with us. So if everyone's happy with that, we will have Kieran start off next week and just go back over it, because I think the work that he is doing in this space is very important, and some of the research findings that is coming out of that project is really relevant to what we're covering. So I really want to thank you, Kieran, for persevering, and thank you, Ange, Steph and John, for your time today. You will see there, everyone, there should have been a poll pop up there. I really do encourage you to please take a moment just to complete that. It does help us to demonstrate the valuing of the learning series like this to project funding partners. And I think you'll also agree that this is becoming a very important subject, and one that we need to have more conversation around and certainly gain that better understanding, especially in a variable climate like we have. Next week is pretty exciting. We will start off with Kieran's, and then we're going to go into covering that genetics, fertility and neonatal management. And we'll look at learnings from the Calf Alive project. How many generations do we have to play with in a breeding herd that is productive in a varying climate, and that importance of breed and trait selection in building a herd that is productive, not just now, but into that future. And we'll also have a look at the epigenetics. This is something that's very fascinating. We're going to look at learnings from the dairy industry and also the human research side of things. We probably will do a short video for you as well that will put a link into how to look at My Climate View and how you can look at your region going forward and what that trend is looking like from a minimum and maximum temperature point of view and humidity. So I'd like to thank all our presenters today, and we look forward to having you all back next week. If you haven't done so, I thoroughly encourage you to register for the field days that we'll have coming up. You'll start to see we'll do some demonstrations, and that looking at the radiant heat, and also have a look at livestock and just have a look at panting scores, that sort of thing, and have some of those robust Q&A sessions. If we don't have a field day in your area and you'd really like one, please let me know. But you'll be able to indicate that in your survey that you receive tomorrow with the webinar recording link. Thank you, everyone. It's been a really great learning. And Steph, I think it's very exciting, that work that's coming out. And I can see going forward, we need to start wearing badges of clean faces, less dusty faces in our cattle yards as a badge of honour, instead of our typical one we like to share of our dusty faces and clothes at the end of a workday. Let's see if we can't start to manage for a better lung health in our livestock. So thank you very much, everyone.